I think we're good. Yeah, meeting is streaming. I'm going to make sure that the speaker, and I'm just going to try to mute everybody, although that doesn't always work. Yeah, you're all muted. Okay, good. So I'll share my screen and we'll get cracking. So my slides, as I say, don't fully match what I'm at. Hang on, should I just make this big again? Sorry. Can you guys see me? You're all muted. Yeah. Okay, well, it doesn't matter.
Yes.
See me. Oh, yeah, good. Okay. Right, so we're live. So April 1921. So as the war raged on in 1921 and De Valera began to reassert himself more firmly, both as head of the Dáil, but also, I suppose, as commander, you know, because don't forget he had been in America the year before. Tensions were apparent on all sides, both within the Irish community and, of course, the British side. The war was still being fought by the flying columns, ostensibly under the control of Michael Collins and really the IRB at the centre of the Irish Republican Army. Although it was clear that local leaders were making decisions on the ground. The national strategy, if one could be said to exist, seemed to centre still on disrupting communications for the British, trying to find these high-profile targets, the counter spies, you know, that Michael Collins and his circle, the 12 Apostles, had been targeting, and then killing spies and informers, even if they no longer lived in Ireland. So how that was enacted differed from district to district, but really by April in 1921 there is fighting in every county really, although we said, you know, Kerry, Cork, the north is heating up, Mayo very hot, and Clare in 1921, Dublin too. So the Irish Bulletin, that newspaper kind of organ, carried a weekly review of the war in Ireland column, which attributed the attacks now to the Irish troops and the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, by name. De Valera was very focused on establishing a Department of Foreign Affairs. Basically, he's acting as if the country is already independent and he's determined to have diplomatic relations with other nations as equals. The British soldiers on the ground still seemed to be very reactive. Reprisals continue against the civilian population, and there are some horrible cases of mistaken identity where they shoot, you know, friendly fire, kind of kill their own people in April. As for the British government, we now know that there were back-channel communications between several parties, including our own Governor Glynn here in Albany, trying to encourage peace. Just what that looked like, though, you know, whether it was going to be a surrendering on the behalf of the IRA or, you know, how it would work was still a little bit up in the air. So there were efforts being made publicly to encourage Sinn Féin to acknowledge this kind of peace momentum, as the British government released press releases seeming to suggest that this was almost a done deal. British propaganda then attempts to capitalise on military victories by driving a wedge between moderates and extremists within the Republican movement. The effort to identify individuals with whom they could negotiate a settlement played on existing Republican fears that some of their leaders might compromise with the British. And of course, this, you know, leads to tension in the ranks. The Weekly Summary republished a statement from the Cork Constitution that the government require that any who undertake to speak for Ireland shall leave all thoughts of an independent Irish Republic outside the council board. So, you know, maybe don't forget, of course, partition had become a reality now in 1920 with the passing of the Government of Ireland Act. So, you know, there is a new state, the 6-county state in the north of Ireland, which, you know, has to be taken into consideration. Another statement, which the British reproduced but originally appeared in the Freeman's Journal, asserted that men of moderate views are making peace overtures. So the difference in strategy desired by De Valera and Collins was still playing out. In April, the general headquarters of the IRA made another major effort at reorganisation. Hoping to increase coordination between the brigades, IRA leaders decided to group them into divisions based on geography. So in April, Ernie O'Malley presided over a meeting in County Cork to form what would be called the 1st Southern Division. The officers present, who represented the brigades from Cork, Kerry, West Limerick and Waterford, agreed on the need for greater cooperation, but some of them viewed the division scheme as simply administration run amok. O'Malley began the meeting by reading a memorandum from General Headquarters, which raised the already simmering ire of the Cork officers, who were very hard pressed, very active down there in Cork, and they felt they were getting little support from HQ. Sean Moylan recalled the document as follows. We've met Sean Moylan before in the large ambush that we covered in February. He said, those who wrote such communications at GHQ seemed to have as bedside books a Bible and a copy of General Letow Vorbeck's Story of the War in East Africa. From this and infantry training 1914, I assume came the inexplicable military periods and inapplicable military proposals which this communication contained. So, again, it probably is the difference really in outlook between De Valera's policy, where he's kind of embarrassed almost by this guerrilla warfare, and then Collins's more pragmatic approach. Commandant Sean O'Hegarty of the 1st Cork Brigade told O'Malley that GHQ should focus on organising the West or the Midlands to try to take the pressure off the South, and he suggested that Richard Mulcahy or Mick Collins should visit the region to see the situation for themselves. Moylan told Tom Barry in private, "We started this war with Hurleys, but by heavens, it seems to me we will finish it off with fountain pens." Barry himself noted that the divisional structure did not and could not add a man, a rifle, a bomb, a round of ammunition, or a shilling to the strength of any brigade, nor did it organise any action or issue a single operation order to any unit. So maybe Cork were right to be concerned over the profusion of new officers and ranks within the IRA. While trying to respond in a systematic way to problems that surfaced throughout this war, Republican headquarters set up a complex and variegated command structure which involved local battalions, brigades, divisions, and semi-independent flying columns. All of these units had to relate to one another and with the national leadership in Dublin. On paper, hierarchy was well defined, and need only be respected in order for the organisation to function smoothly. But of course, in practice, in local small areas where leadership is based, there's issues of personal pride, ambition, jealousy, and safety concerns, and that complicated the individual relationships between officers. The flying columns in particular set up a strange dynamic within the brigades. GHQ mandated that brigades form flying columns, but did not produce any uniform guidelines or place those officers within the existing command structure. The articles on membership of brigade councils and the duties of brigade officers don't even reference flying column commanders, for instance. Local units were left to work these issues out on their own. So theoretically, the column commander was in charge of all of the volunteers under his control during the planning and execution of operations. Brigade commandants could serve in a unit, but they were expected to obey the column commander. Outside the column, officers in that unit returned to their normal ranks in the army, and the brigade staff would be in charge. So for instance, in West Cork, Commandant Charlie Hurley at times served under Tom Barry with the brigade's flying column, and there doesn't seem to have been any animosity or strain in that relationship. So even though he's the commandant of the West Cork region, he answers to Tom Barry if he's within the flying column. Barry, in fact, praised Hurley, who happened to be killed on the morning of Crossbarry, over several publications. So basically, to start looking at the April kind of skirmishes that we're going to cover, this is just that's the long thing. I'll come to that one in a second. But to give you an example of what's happening in Dublin, for instance, the Dublin Brigade launched a gunfire and grenade attack on the London and North Western Railway Hotel, which was located on North Wall Quay. It was occupied by the auxiliaries who were using it as a base for searching ships in the dock areas. CJ Street wrote that the assault produced no result, but showed perhaps that the Republican forces were prepared to take the offensive, even in Dublin, which was the seat, of course, of British power. And I mentioned the most notable region in Ireland to experience a general rise in action was the new Northern Ireland. Comprising of the 6 northeastern counties, this statelet had a core of 4 counties which were dominated by Unionists. In accordance with Lloyd George's 2-parliament idea, the area was officially partitioned from the rest of the country with the passage of the Government of Ireland Act in 1920. The region had mostly experienced kind of mob violence and barrack attacks, but on April 5th, The Times reported that Republican flying columns were now operating up in that region. Republican activity in Derry and Belfast, which had been rocked by sectarian riots throughout the conflict, and we covered those in one of the earlier talks, now take on an organised nature. And so police and military posts were simultaneously attacked in Derry, for instance, on the 1st of April. But this story, and this is just to show you the kind of change in, not change in tactics, but the breadth of tactics that the IRA were using at this time. So on April 10th, Privates George Motley and John Steer, both from the East Lancashire Regiment, were captured by the IRA at Barraduff in County Kerry. They were moved around the countryside for about 6 months before being shot. Now, I might have talked about this before because Kerry were certainly doing this, taking hostages and moving them around from the late 1920s. So they were shot after being in captivity for 6 months, and their bodies were dumped. And again, this is not the first time the IRA had dumped bodies in a bog, and were not recovered until January 1927. When Motley was returned, the body was returned and buried in Nabwood Cemetery in West Yorkshire near his home, and Steer was sent back to Accrington in Lancashire. Both received full military honours. So that's kind of what the newspaper accounts from 1927. Jeremiah Murphy, in his memoir of Kerry from 1902 to 1925, When Youth Was Mine, says that several spies were apprehended in the spring and early summer of 1921. And I'm quoting from him here, "Some of these pulled the old trick of pretending to be deserters. How they expected to get away with such a slim veneer baffles me. The authorities were desperate for information, or these fellows must have been overtly anxious to serve in that capacity. Either way, it was suicide. 2 of these strangers were seen riding on a bicycle along the main road to Killarney. They were overtaken by Danny Reen and others from the Rathmore Company and taken along for further investigation. They readily admitted being deserters." So I suppose trying to, certainly say that they're not spies. "No charges could be held against them, but they were held and moved about from one company to another for weeks afterwards. By this time, of course, they had become acquainted with a lot of places and people. The IRA reasoned that this might be their intended strategy. A little later, they helped convict another spy, and that only served to thicken the plot. They were carefree, intelligent, typical middle-class English." So, the IRA are a bit panicked because now they're taking these people around with them and exposing more and more of the secret hideaways. So the sudden rush of deserters implied to the IRA that there was going to be a big anti-IRA operation coming up, and that the British were gathering intelligence in advance of it. Otherwise, as Jeremiah says, why should so many deserters show up in this part of the country? Eventually, information on a large-scale roundup did reach the local IRA, and he says, "Our 2 young English gentlemen deserters who had been arrested about a month before were now shot as spies. They were buried in a lonely bog, but their remains were given finally to their relatives by the Free State authorities. A rather tragic end to a mission which must have appealed to them when they took it on. Well, someone had to get the information, but it's too bad when someone gets caught at it." And I think that boy Steer was only 18. This English man who had been kidnapped, we'll say, or arrested by the IRA. So there's the Manchester Guardian in 1927 sharing the story. Now, the story is much, much more kind of dark, and King was certainly a character that was worth exploring. He had been involved, they reckon, he had been involved in the bloody Sunday killings that night after the attack on the GAA, at Croke Park. And he had also been arrested in April. He was arrested for 2 nights, for a murder. I think we covered the story actually in February. So Captain King, who was the commanding officer of the F Company Auxiliary Division of the RIC, was tried by court-martial over 2 days, the 13th and 14th of April, for the murder of James Murphy in February up in Dublin. Murphy's dying declaration was declared inadmissible at his trial. 2 auxiliaries provided alibis for Captain King at the time of the murder, and so King was acquitted. Now, To give you his background, he had, fought with the army in World War I, I think in Africa and, a couple of other places. He was then in 1920 rejoined the British Army. He was appointed the commander of the F Company Auxiliary Division based in Dublin Castle. Company commanders in the Auxiliary Division held the equivalent police rank of a first-class district inspector. Prisoners, Irish prisoners who were captured with seditious documents of any importance or weapons were taken to Dublin Castle to be interrogated in the intelligence office, not exclusively by the team of Captain Jocelyn Hardy and Captain William Lorraine Tiny King MC. Now Hardy, so these boys kind of worked in tandem. Hardy was described as small in stature in the uniform of the Connacht Rangers. He had piercing blue-rimmed eyes and huge black pupils. Tiny, the other fellow, was 6 foot and apparently, a very tall, intimidating kind of a character. Between these two men, torture and murder was the rule of the day. Ernie O'Malley described Hardy's interrogation technique as a combination with the efforts of Major King of violent beatings in the face, strangulation, screaming threats, followed by a mock execution with a blank firing pistol near the back of the head in the windowless dungeons of Dublin Castle. O'Malley survived his ordeal. Others confessed. One at least became an unsuccessful double agent who was shot dead on a golf course in Middlesex later. And of course, others died in the environs of the prison. Private Swindlehurst, whose diaries are found in the Imperial War Museum, recalled that interrogated suspects were dragged out of the interrogation rooms more dead than alive, with Hardy and this guy. David Nelligan, who was, the chief spy of Michael Collins, he remarked that he thought Hardy had a hair-trigger temper and that he was missing a slate, meaning him to be insane. There certainly seemed to be propensity towards violence, with less concern in getting information than with beating victims to a pulp. So a witness statement written by Commandant Martin Finn, for instance, said, prior to the raid on my home previously referred to, Captain King, well known subsequently as an active intelligence officer for the British, had been stopping in the local hotel for a period, ostensibly engaged as a sales representative for the Minimax Fire Extinguisher Company, an English company with headquarters in Dublin. He apparently used this as a means of travelling around the country with a view to obtaining information regarding the movements of the IRA. So in 1920, November, King was implicated and court-martialed for the deaths of Conor Clune, Pather Clancy and Dick McGee. Remember, they had been imprisoned before. The Cairo gang were assassinated that morning, and then they were apparently shot as they tried to break out of the prison, so these McGee and Clancy especially had been two leading lights in the Dublin IRA, and Conor Clune was just a Gaelic League member who had been captured kind of mistakenly with them. Clune was caught at Vaughan's Hotel in Parnell Square, and the two other IRA leaders were in Lower Gloucester Street. They were found with British Army officer uniforms and detonators. Sometime between then and the next day, in the Dublin Castle guard room, as news filtered in of the deaths of several British intelligence officers, the prisoners were killed in very questionable circumstances. According to the official report from Dublin Castle, they attempted to grab rifles and hurl unfused grenades, and so they were killed in that action. The guards of the F Company in the room at the time were cleared of wrongdoing by court-martial. Major Reynolds of the F Company is said to have passed details of the killers to Michael Collins. The Times noted, mind you, that it seemed as if the prisoners had been lined up and shot. And so this man now got away with the second time. So here is this pro forma the arrest, his own, this is the, arrest papers from that man that they killed, James Murphy. So they put a pail over James Murphy's head and told him he was just going for a drive, and then shot him. And it took a few minutes for him to die because there was a kind of a bucket over his head. So he was injured through his two cheeks and through the back of the head. And then, but he was able to make a kind of a statement to his brother and implicated these two guys. And very quickly, King was found innocent and went back to work. He actually was, they swapped him. I seem to be missing a page of my talk. They swapped him out of Dublin down to Galway, and he was allegedly very annoyed. He spoke to he spoke to Ernie Malley apparently in passing in the yard and said that he was being used as a kind of a scapegoat, you know, for the politicians. And he ends his days in England. He lives on a golf course. He does actually serve in World War II again, and he died in 1942, I think, killed in action as far as I know. But he, you know, he was one of those ones that actually was on the list to be killed on the morning of Bloody Sunday, because he was working as this intelligence officer going around pretending to sell fire extinguishers. And he ironically was in Dublin Castle interrogating prisoners, and so he wasn't in the hotel that he was supposed to be in, and they weren't able to shoot him. But you know, it's kind of interesting. Now here's Arthur Vickers. So this is another story that, you know, to be honest, we still don't really know the answer to this. Arthur Vickers is an interesting story. He was related to the O'Mahonys, Pierce O'Mahony and George. They were stepbrothers, and the local seat, their home, was Kilmorna. I think, yeah, there's Kilmorna House, down just outside my hometown, the Stole. Funnily enough, Arthur Vickers had been in charge of the crown jewels, the Irish crown jewels, when they were stolen in 1912. Long, convoluted, typically Irish story. You know, they built a strong room, only to discover in Dublin Castle, only to discover after building it that the door was too narrow and they couldn't get the safe into the room. So they decided they would leave the safe in the library, and for some reason never really used the safe, or never locked the library door. And long story short, he gave a tour to some people, and like 2 days later, the housekeeper, the cleaner of the library, discovered the door open, the safe empty, and the Irish crown jewels gone. They reckon it was the brother of Shackleton who was kind of involved in this as well. I forget what his position was. They think Shackleton, who was gay, and another man actually stole them, but it kind of tinged Vickers', you know, reputation. And he kind of goes home to Kerry to lick his wounds. He's given the use of this house. So Kilmorna House and Grounds passed to Arthur Vickers' sister, and so she kind of offered him, you know, live in the house for as long as you want. And he did absolutely love the house, because of course it was everything that a man like him, who wanted to be part of high society, you know, wanted. It stood on 600 acres of beautiful countryside. There were 3 gate lodge houses with painted roofs and lovely kind of stone wall entrances. Some of those actually lodges still stand and are being lived in today. Kilmorna House was built of brick, surfaced with smooth Kerry stone and lovely ivy flowers climbing up the window. On the west side of the house, there was lime trees parading down to the bank of the River Field, which, you know, was rich with salmon and trout. So he had a beautiful kind of, you know, pastoral life down there. Now, at the age of 53, Sir Arthur, to the surprise of many, married a Miss Gertrude Wright of Killorry House near Castle Island. Over 100 local people were employed either directly or indirectly by him, and he paid them wages above the rate for the town. So actually, he was quite a good landlord. Older people in Kilmorna, you know, talk about the parties that used to be organised by him for the children at Christmas time. Apparently, he rode around the local farms on horseback. He owned the only car in the district, and, you know, once or twice a week would drive into Listowel town, handing out the produce from Kilmorna House gardens and orchards to needy families, Protestant and Catholic alike. His wife had little Yorkshire Terrier dogs, and in the event of the death of one of these creatures, organised a funeral, and the workmen on the estate were expected to dress in black and look solemn. So Arthur retired, as I say, you know, in kind of shame to Kilmorna House, and built allegedly a strong room for his wife's jewels, for the silver, the valuable books and paintings and things that were in this estate. And naturally, of course, word spread in the district that there was this huge kind of pile of jewels, you know, that they should be there. Now, I should say too, he became kind of a notice of the IRA. His house, the house here that he was living in, was broken into in April of 1920, and they kind of warned him to get out, and he refuses to go. So he thought, that he was so well liked in the district and stuff that he would not be harmed. Everyone knew he gave out turkeys, for instance, at Christmas, but he also presented the Black and Tans in the Listowel barracks with turkeys at Christmas to thank them for their protection of him. So finally, on the 14th of April in 1921, I'm just going to go back. There's the train station. Like, it was a very wealthy, kind of area. And here he is there. He was warned in April 21. It said they got an announcement, and the Dublin Council heard about it, that Sir Arthur Vickers of Kilmorna House was taken from his bed in his dressing gown this morning and murdered outside his house. A label was placed around his neck with the words "Spy, Informers Beware," signed the IRA. They set fire to the house, which burnt completely, and all of the contents and everything were lost. There's nothing, left of the house today. And they reckon about 30 armed men participated. Now, where it gets kind of funny is the IRA at the time disavowed that they had anything to do with it. It seems, I actually just went to a talk on this last week with an Irish journalist. They reckon that it kind of was local Irish people who just wanted to do a land grab on the estate. And so, it's very hard to know. It looks like it wasn't sanctioned by the IRA. As I say, they were very quick to deny that they had anything to do with it. But, otherwise locally, we know the names of people who were involved in the IRA who said they did it. But the IRA officially renounced it at the time. And that's unusual. That they normally do kind of take credit. So he knew he had been warned. He was in bed at 10 o'clock in the morning when his wife rushed into the room to tell him that there were men with pistols in the house. He ordered the servants to save as many valuable things as possible. The manager, who was a man called Michael Murphy, told him that the men said they had only come to burn the house and nobody would be harmed. Now, at this point, somebody had already alerted the army from Kilmorna railway station that I just showed you. So they were on their way out from Listowel, but it's about, a 10-15 minute drive, probably more in those days. Arthur was stood under the guns of the three men against a beech tree and shot 3 times in the chest and neck and twice in the head. So, it was very kind of badly put together. The O'Mahonys of Kerry called in lawyers, his family, to formulate a claim for compensation against the British government. And they valued Kilmorna House at about £15,000. People came from the town to look at the ruin. This house had been absolutely beautiful and now burnt to the ground. Their children played with the bits of suits of armor that they found lying on the terrace. And, everybody was looking at the little dog cemetery that Lady Vickers had put in there. But it was kind of shocking for most people. So all that remains of this estate today is an oak tree that was planted by Parnell 67 years before it was burnt down. And it was said that he allegedly said he hoped we would have home rule in Ireland before the magpies built their nests in the trees. So, that was an interesting little aside that who knows kind of what happened. Now, so this is one of the men who is alleged to have been shot in reprisal for he was a spy. So they've tracked this guy. These stories now, I'm not going to go into detail with these ones because I want to do something else. But you can see these are 2 Irishmen that they tracked down in London. He was shot on a golf course, and the note left on his body said, "Let spies and traitors beware." And so those are the 2 men who are alleged to have shot him. These 2 men here are alleged to have shot the guy Faughrogue. And then here is Major McKinnon, who was also shot on the golf course in Tralee by the IRA. It's kind of an interesting, he had been to Sandhurst, this is in April as well. And then this last story, ORIC District Inspector Gilbert Potter was returning by car from police duties when he was held as a hostage for the safe release of this man, Thomas Traynor. Let me just move that down. So he was another one of these men that was held, for months on months, assured that he'd be fine. But then Traynor was hanged by the British, and so Potter was shot dead by the IRA. And he's written, these letters to his families. This goes on all throughout April. Dearest wife, I hope you have had news of me through my letter. The IRA say you can send me a parcel if you take steps that the method of sending it is not known and kept secret. I want, he says, clean long drawers, a clean long cotton vest, clean cotton shirt, pair of socks, big boots. And he tells her which pair would be better: the waterproof coat, a safety razor with 24 new blades, shaving brush, soap, a small sponge, a toothbrush. If you put the lot in a cloth haversack like the RIC have, I could carry it. Don't be too troubled, as the people I meet are really kind and could supply everything except a safety razor. Now, don't forget, these are men on the run as well. Now, darling wife, God will help us. My love to you, Hilda, Georgie, Charles, and Freddie. Could you send me £1? Your husband, Gilbert. And then he said, I request those in authority with the IRA to send to my wife my notebook, which contains messages for her and my will. There are, I am sure, humane leaders who will pity a wife who is Irish, as I am also. G.N. Potter. Enclosed in the box for my wife, a wristwatch, gold ring, cigarette holder, silver matchbox, set of keys, cigarette case, letter for her, and one for the Bishop of Waterford. And so, you know, this is kind of frightful, you know, what's going on with them. And obviously they kind of get to know these people too. And then here's another same type of story. Major Compton Smith was held by the IRA. Here he is. This is the house that he was held in Donaghmore. And eventually he was shot, you know, also by the IRA. And he wrote a letter to his regiment on his final day. I should like my death to lessen rather than increase the bitterness that exists between England and Ireland. My cigarette case I leave to the mess. I shall die with it in my pocket. And they're now exhibited in Carnarvon Castle in Wales in their museum. So, you know, this kind of human side of the story, I think is very touching. Now, I'm just going to quickly run through some of the political items, because this is absolutely fascinating. You know, how you build a nation from the ground up, and particularly, I think, you know, what De Valera is talking about. Some of these papers are fascinating. Like, you know, there was a guy wrote back from England with a long, detailed list of the money he had spent, and he wanted to be paid back, you know. But I'm just going to talk you through some of these more important letters. So this was an extract from a letter from Eamon De Valera to Robert Brennan, who's that guy there, on the 1st of April 1921. Originally, I think on account of Griffith, Arthur Griffith, the Count, this he means Count Plunkett, and myself being named to represent Ireland at Paris. Don't forget, they thought they were going to go to the Versailles Treaty. In forming the cabinet 2 years ago, I proposed that foreign affairs, instead of being under one head, should be controlled by us three in commission. Or if under our constitution that was not possible, that I should myself retain the nominal headship. So straight away, like, we have now three people in charge of foreign affairs. De Valera didn't go to Versailles, don't forget, you know, and so who's in charge? He says, I did not think there was ever a definite decision on that point, and I have always acted as if the commission principle had been accepted. So namely, the three of them were in charge. Before I came out of Lincoln jail, the Count was sole secretary for foreign affairs. Now, don't forget, Count Plunkett had stood for election in 1918 because his son was killed in 1916 as one of the martyrs. He says, whilst I was in America, I am not sure whether he had become to be regarded definitively as the Minister for Foreign Affairs, but in any case, he is an associate minister of that department, so he can give you much information about foreign matters generally, especially about such matters as those for which we were on the lookout for the legal attaché to deal with. Please consult him on matters concerning the department as much as possible, and seek his opinions in advance so as to have them for me on such questions as foreign appointments, etc. I am sending you a letter which I received from him recently. And then I love this. Despite my efforts to cut it down by departmentalizing it, my correspondence is increasing. You will do your utmost in your domain to reduce it to a minimum. So that's great. He says, I am working at the foreign affairs stuff and will give you definite decisions on all points as soon as possible. With, as regards our representatives abroad, he says, copies of all Dáil Parliament decrees as they are passed should be sent. When they are inserted in the bulletin, a reference will be sufficient. And then Robert Brennan replies, which I think is hilarious. Your letter of April 1st, re the Count, raises an entirely new situation. I understood when taking office I would have nothing to do with him as regards direction of the department, and that I was to regard myself as if I was head of the department and responsible to you personally and directly. My sole objection to the new arrangement is that it will make the work of this department cumbersome and slow already, practically impossible. Joint direction is bad anytime. It is worse when not strictly defined, and in the present circumstances, it will mean merely a further break on the activities of this department, already heavily handicapped by slow communication and the absence of direct and immediate touch. If I am to consult the Count on such things as the address, for instance, not to speak of the representatives going abroad, when do you think it would be sent out? Consultations are out of the question. They would be a useless waste of time on my part and would merely shorten my present period of being at large. You will understand there's nothing personal in this. We are best of friends. I only want to avoid clogging machinery, which, as it is not running too smoothly, and I think it is best to face the situation squarely. I return the Count's letter herewith. So, you know, very difficult to try to set up. And Robert Brennan was in Dublin as well. It's not like, you know, he was out foreign. So then De Valera writes to Arthur Griffith. And I think this was an interesting point too. He says, one of the main things that has made our movement a success is the simplicity of the objective and the directness of the methods, no elaborate constructive schemes, etc. The time hasn't yet come when we should even consider the idea of sacrificing any of these to any dream, no matter how attractive. League of Nations ideas are the hardest in the world to materialize, but an entente between ourselves, the Scotch, Welsh, and the overseas dominions, as if they were nations independent of England, should be encouraged. We will need a delicate touch in handling anything of this sort, because we must make it clear that it is as an external to the British system that we are acting, and that we are dealing with these countries as if they were also nations independent of England. And that's very interesting, because don't forget, in New York in 1914 and 15 and 16, there was a massive cooperation between the Indian kind of nationalists here and the Irish nationalists. And in fact, you know, they may even have been money kind of donated to Devoy and Casement and all of that for the 1916 Rising. So I thought that was very interesting. And then one of the countries that they focused that attempt at kind of going on as if the Commonwealth was made up of separate but equal nations is South Africa. So I just have two sort of shorter letters from two different representatives in South Africa. So the first one is from Patrick Little from South Africa, 14th of April, he's in Cape Town, and on the 20th of April, he went to Johannesburg. He says, I arrived Sunday the 10th. The ground has been well prepared by the Irish Republican Association, which was started 6 months before. The Irish population is 10,000 out of total white population 1,250,000. I'm using their own language. Natives and half-breeds number 10 million. There were about 50,000 Catholics. So 10,000 Irish out of a white population of 1.25 million and 50,000 Catholics. The IRA run a fortnightly journal, The Republic. No, it's not the IRA, sorry, it's the Irish Republican Association. That journal has a circulation of 2,300, increasing by 50 a fortnight. There were 13 branches of the association, which held its first annual meeting in Bloemfontein in February. Total membership is probably 1,000. The principles of this organization are not to be entangled in South African politics, declaration of allegiance to the idea of an Irish Republic, only those of Irish birth or descent are eligible, and the members all act as citizens of South Africa. Johannesburg, 1,000 miles from Cape Town, is the biggest Irish centre. I have arrived just in time to attend the meeting of Central Council there to discuss sending a deputation to Smuts, Prime Minister, prior to his departure for England. I have decided to describe myself as the accredited emissary of Eamon de Valera, a description which gives weight and gives no technical excuses for hostile action. But it's interesting, you know, he's the accredited emissary of the President of the Republic, not of the Republic, you know, a bit interesting. The English-speaking community is not interested. Part of it is intensely anti-Irish and anti-Catholic. A public meeting in Kimberley would result in the wrecking of Irish people's houses. The Dutchmen are with us through hatred of England, but they are Calvinistic, very ignorant and prejudiced against Catholics. The nationalists would like us to use the Irish as a stick to beat Smuts with. The Dutch papers accept anything favouring us. The English papers are entirely jingo. The Cape Times would not accept even an advertisement about the association. There is no reason why I should stay here more than 3 months. There is no serious work to be done, and expenses are enormous owing to the immense distances. I think you should limit my stay here to 3 months and cable me if I can go on to South America. Smuts gets to London, the work here will grow less important. We will have a public campaign for the month before he goes. Irish hope for very little from Smuts. He says he is sympathetic, but I have turned my back on republicanism in my own country. How can I support it in Ireland? The reputation is of being slim. So he gets a similar report from a guy called Maurice Moore, who's also in South Africa, on the 21st of April. He says, I am told that the majority of the Irish and Irish South Africans are favourable to us, but as far as South African politics are concerned, they are followers of Smuts. Being English speaking, they naturally fall in line with their fellow speakers. They are quite ignorant of Irish history or the Irish question, but may be redeemed by the movement now taking place and by the Republic newspaper, which I hear is doing good work and has a circulation of 2,300. Was just 1,000 in the other guy. I gather that the Dutch Republicans are sympathetic and their newspapers are willing to publish our news, but the policy adopted by the Irish has been to keep aloof from South African parties. This is, of course, right, although for the moment it leaves us rather lonely. Smuts, being at the head of a coalition and dependent on unionist votes, places him in a different position from what he was in as the head of the South African party, Dutch. He will be very much tied down as far as our interests are concerned, and indeed, as far as I can judge of the short examination, he seems to be in a difficult position for his own home politics. It will be hard to pass any measure that will not offend some of his followers. I hear he is therefore avoiding any legislation and trying to end the session. He is not trusted by the Dutch, as Botha was. The influence which can be brought to bear on Smuts and his friends are small. The transference of the Irish vote, even if it could be effective, would not, I am told, affect more than 2 or 3 seats. Yet, when parties are close, even this is not to be neglected. On the other hand, Smuts' majority is considerable, and as newly elected, he may last 5 years. He says, the personal inclination of Smuts does remain to help the Irish for 3 reasons. Because the Irish have always helped the Boers in their struggle for freedom, idealistic views of freedom for small nations, he may think that it is to the advantage of the British Empire, but this last would not carry him towards independence. My idea, he says, is to induce Smuts to advocate freedom for Ireland in as wide an extent as his sympathy and his policy will permit, as far as he can bring himself to go, and to insist on this as an immediate measure, brooking no delay. He can hardly refuse to go as far as the South African Constitution, although many of his unionist followers will not like even that. Yet he is indispensable to them and he can force them to submit. I think it can be shown to him that considering his relative distance from England and the greater influence due to proximity, a larger measure is necessary to produce equality of treatment. I fear he will not go beyond repeal of the Union. That would not mean that we would accept that or give him to understand that it might be a final settlement. And then the last one is from De Valera to the Director of Publicity on 24th of April, and it's marked urgent. If you were approached by the press with reference to the new peace rumours, answer in substance as follows. The public are now accustomed to this ruse of the British. If a special infamy has to be covered up or a special difficulty has to be got out of, a pretence of initiating a new peace move is set up. Notwithstanding all rumours, peace negotiations properly so called, there are none. Of that you can be sure. On the other hand, President De Valera would scarcely have refused to see Lord Derby if he sought an interview. Nice straddling of the fence there. The President's attitude is very simple and plain, and whether in private or in public, the same. It expresses the attitude of the nation. England is the aggressor. Once the aggression is removed, there can be peace. If the aggression and interference is maintained, it will be resisted. England has no right whatever in Ireland. The presence of her forces here is an invasion of the right of the Irish people. They must be removed. The Irish people must be recognised as an independent nation with the right to determine freely its own government. Interference or dictation from outside must be ended. That done, England and Ireland might well be the most friendly of neighbours. For your own information and to be treated as confidential, Lord Derby requested an interview with me. He came over for it. I saw him as I would any influential public person or pressman, just as Lloyd George is receiving the group of Irishmen, Messrs. Jameson, etc. I want you to be constantly on the alert and to be close at hand so that through your department, we can make sure that no other complexion is put upon this meeting. It is likely that we shall have to use you as our fighting arm in a special way for the next month or two. there will be the greatest need for skillful handling on our part. I believe that a big drive will be made to divide the country. We must keep in the closest consultation and personal contact all the time, and everything that it is proposed to issue officially dealing with peace must be submitted to me. By the way, I sent you a copy of a wire forwarded to the convention in Chicago for publication. If the press wouldn't take it, it should have been put in the bulletin. I send you here with another copy. Like the previous communication, it would have been far more appropriate some days ago than now. We mustn't lose the tide in these things. Eamon de Valera. So that is an incredible insight, I think, into, you know, the machinations that are going on behind the scenes and kind of high level, you know, foreign diplomatic affairs that they're talking about. But de Valera, you know, like that's a fairly strongly worded statement. You know, England is the aggressor. If the aggression is removed, there can be peace. And yet admitting in the same, you know, letter that yes, Lord Derby did ask to meet him. So I think it's very interesting. So to recap for April, GHQ has been successful in molding the IRA at this point into an effective guerrilla force, and they're almost at the stage where they can compel the British government to negotiate a truce. But the body itself, and this might be down to the personalities involved, was unwieldy, and the command structure very complicated and convoluted, which leads, of course, to massive indiscipline in the ranks after they call the truce. So we can perhaps see the beginnings of the split, which kind of follows the treaty in this period of time here, where there's an awful lot of commanders, you know, there's layers of bureaucracy, and there's very strong-willed people with already seemingly divergent, you know, kind of views. And at this point, we're only 2 or 3 months out, don't forget, from the truce, which is negotiated in the summer. So it's heating up. So that's the end of the presentation. You can unmute yourselves if you like, and if anyone has a question or comment. No. Let me just go into Facebook too and see if anyone has comments there. Do you have any questions? Oh. No one. Michael? Oh, I can't hear you. Yeah, you're back.
De Valera didn't go to Versailles. Was that because he wasn't invited, or was that a choice?
I'd say he was in prison at the time. He wanted to go. Well, when I say he wanted to go, he probably would have gone, but sometimes I think with de Valera, to be honest, it suits his purpose, you know, to not be blamed for the failures when they happen. But he was in prison, in fairness, from that time. So I'm almost positive. And then, you know, he's broken out of prison and goes to America.
Yes.
In late 1919. So yeah, he's in Lincoln jail. But again, I do think that kind of thing suits him. You know, like he can't be held responsible then if things don't go right.
He has a habit of that, yes.
Yeah. Anyone else have anything? I am surprised, I must say, at how functioning the government appears to be. Like it is amazing, you know, that they're even trying to run a sort of a diplomatic mission to South Africa, you know, in 1921. It's amazing. And I think tactically, they seem to, you know, be, I think, making the right choice. You know, like they're keeping an eye on Smuts, they're keeping an eye on his power structure and where that's going to go. They certainly have a presence, you know, they have a presence in Russia. In fact, the Irish government end up with the Russian crown jewels at one point. We keep them until the 40s, I think. That's a whole other, I must look into that story for another talk. There's, you know, they have diplomatic missions in, of course, America, and in Europe, you know, Maud Gonne's son is in France, is it her son is in France, you know, so there's people in throughout the world, you know, trying to argue, but of course most people are being, you know, politely meeting them, but not, you know, if everyone had kind of adopted de Valera's way of just like, we're going to act as if we were independent nations, but like they don't, you know, and particularly 1920, 21, they're just after World War One. You know, England was on the side of France, you know, and so it's difficult for them.
How long did it take them to get the crown jewels back? after they were stolen.
They never found them, Rita. That's a great,
Wow.
yeah, they never found them. So allegedly, now again, like this is, you know, one of the great unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. Apparently, Shackleton and his buddy, I forget what the guy's name was, they think they stole them and like broke them down 3 years later, and that there was kind of a blackmail plot, that the British government knew this because apparently one of them had information about, you know, homosexual orgies that they were going to release to the public. But, you know, like we hear this with, you know, poor old Roger Casement. Homosexuality was a threat, I think, leveled a lot, you know, at the time. And so, and don't forget like Oscar Wilde, you know, earlier on.
Right.
So, but it's interesting, yeah, apparently it was kind of an open secret that Ernest Shackleton's brother, you know, had something to do with it. But I must, there's a book actually, Arthur Vickers, I think it's called, on the Irish Crown Jewels, but I've not read it.
Thanks.
And they didn't have a whole pile of jewelry either, you know, it's not like the British ones, but it would be nice to have them back, you know. Yeah. Anyone else? I'm looking to see if anyone on Facebook has a comment or a question. Don't think they do.
Elizabeth, wasn't de Valera's approach perhaps that a de facto approach was the only viable response that they had, because by law, de jure was impossible, so that his maintaining that was the only, as I said, workable type of response.
Yeah.
And so when he was adamant about that, however it seemed unreasonable, it was in fact very rational, in my opinion.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I mean, there was nothing else he could do, really, you know, like you're either kind of going about your business, as you said, de facto, you know, or not. And so, I mean, I do, and I think it's not like they're not engaging, you know, that's what I think is very kind of interesting about the whole thing. They really are campaigning across the country, across the world, I mean, for recognition, you know, for allies. And so I think it was very smart. I suppose I just think, you know, is he a bit cynical sometimes? Like, does he know it's not going to work, and so does that limit his options then, because he has kind of backed himself into a corner? And, you know, later on with the more hardliners, like, you know, if he knows, even in that document, you know, to the publicity department, like he kind of knows there, you know, that it may not work. Thanks, Rita. And yet, you know, he keeps up. So I just worry about that. Like, is he giving false hope to the hardliners that are not as well informed as he is, you know? But as you said, I'm not sure what else he could have done, you know? And like the thing that we forget too is partition is a reality by this stage, you know? So, you know, I don't know if I mean, and we'll see it, you know, we're coming up to the centenary of all that. I read a very interesting article the other day about because, you know, now is the time they should be getting ready to, you know, celebrate the Northern Irish state, but, you know, can you celebrate it, you know? And so it's a very tricky time that we're coming into now in terms of our own commemorations and things, because you know, it was a done deal. You could argue partition was a done deal since 1912, you know, the founding of the Sound League and Covenant, and the time that Home Rule Bill was passed. Like, there was kind of no going back after that, you know. So in one sense, I'm roundabout way that it's a bit confusing, I suppose, for the hardliners. Like, did they really think that the British government was going to backtrack, you know, on 6 or 8 years of unionism and loyalty from the north of Ireland, you know? So it's kind of, it's like as if they almost thought, you know, that we could just undo that with the stroke of a pen, you know, that they forgot the state went ahead up in the north. Like, they, you know, they got ready, they had a first minister, they, you know, they were living their lives as a recognized separate state in a way that the South was not recognized, you know. So yeah, no comments on Facebook. Anything else? Yeah, I love those little inner, those the government documents, so I must get more of those for the next time. The government in Ireland published them. I'll have to look up the name for you. There was kind of select papers, you know, from the early Dáil, And there's a website too, but any of those, the pension files are amazing. Like you can go, and that's, it's a complete rabbit hole trying to construct these talks sometimes, because you get so into one guy's file, and as I say, if I'm only interested in, what he did in April, but maybe he was involved in something fantastic, in 1920 or, thanks, Judy. So yeah, those are fascinating in that military bureau pension, and you can look at all of that online. It's free.
This is probably a whole nother topic, but how did they decide what counties would go to the north? Like with the partition, how was that all decided? Or is there something that you can tell me that I can research more about that?
No, like technically, I mean, we were lucky in one way that it was only 6 of the Ulster counties instead of all 9.
Yeah, I was surprised.
Yeah, so they sort of deliberately do that. It's a bit of gerrymandering. Like they deliberately leave out the 3 counties that have the big Catholic population, and 4 of them have a major Protestant, majority. And then they took, I can't even remember, it must be, Derry maybe and Fermanagh were kind of on the cusp, so they could have gone either way. But it would have been, and I mean, apparently Michael Collins and everyone in the treaty negotiations were told, thanks Michael, everyone were told in the treaty negotiations that like the idea behind the 6 counties instead of the 9 counties had been to make it economically unviable, that as a state it would have to kind of come back in, with Ireland. But they kind of ensured that wouldn't happen by having only 6, because the Protestant vote was a majority. I mean, it still is. They're kind of coming closer and closer, but the Protestant.
So they kind of stacked the cards.
Yeah, they stacked the cards. Yeah, and then like that was kind of used as a threat during the treaty negotiations and a little bit afterwards, because the Boundary Commission, one of the things in the treaty, one of the rules, was that there would be a boundary commission set up to kind of investigate it and to sort of tidy it up a bit for both sides. And those talks were leaked, and in 1920, and it was not favorable for the South. And so everyone kind of, shut up really quickly and went back to their corners and accepted the way it had been drawn up in 1912. And I think that was finalized in 1925. There was a guy called Tom Collins kind of mediating, and it went horribly wrong, so then it just, they left it where it had been originally divided, because Southern Ireland would have lost the other 3 counties.
Okay. Thank you for explaining that.
No problem. Yeah, so if no one has anything else, we'll head away. We're back on Michael, yeah.
No.
I'm just saying goodbye. Good. We're back on Wednesday with what have we? A really interesting kind of family saga. An author from Washington State called Paul Belfort has written a trilogy about, based, I suppose, on kind of family lore and stuff, but 2 families who come to America during the famine, and it's their story spanning, 3 generations. So that'll be really interesting. It's called The Irish in Washington, the Swamp Poodle Trilogy. And then on Thursday, we have Andreas de Stack back again. He's a Shanachie and singer-songwriter. So that'll be at 7 o'clock. We're not charging for that one either this time. We did charge the last time he was on, but we've gotten a grant from Culture Ireland to showcase him, and I'd encourage everyone to come and join him. He's a really good, he tells the old-fashioned stories. He's from County Clare, living now in Galway. So it's kind of traditional Irish stories that you'll hear, the old myths. And then on the 24th, we're going to read the proclamation down at the museum, because that's the actual day of the Easter Rising in 1916. And I think I'm giving a talk about the American influence on the 1916 Rising. And then that week too, we have Darrell McGrath will kind of talk about her husband Jim and his writing for the Times Union. He did a lot of work on, the Good Friday Agreement, and he covered Gerry Adams when he came to Albany first. And we have another talk on the 1916 Rising, the military aspect, on the 29th from the state military historian, Bob Mulligan. So plenty of Easter Rising type stuff to keep you going, and then some culture as well. And then the last one that this month, we have Larry Kerwin from Black 47, which he'll discuss his new novel. It sounds absolutely amazing. It's kind of an Irish-American family affected by 9/11, and that sounds great. It's Rockaway Blues. So I'm looking forward to that. We actually have copies in our store if anyone wants to buy one. So on that note, Thanks all, everyone, and I hope you have a good night and that it doesn't rain too hard. We had lovely weather last week. It's kind of gone cold again this week. But I will see you all hopefully on Wednesday, and thank you for joining us tonight. Great.
Good night.
Take care, everyone. Stay safe. Thank you.
Wonderful, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. Not at all. I'm glad you came. Good night.